You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 326 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Joining me on today's show is Will Porter. Will is the most frequent guest of the show. He's a freelance journalist who really focuses his attention on Mideast affairs and U.S. foreign policy. I'm sure you all know Will. His work has been published at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, The Daily Sheeple, and pretty much everything he writes now ends up at some point on the Libertarian Institute, where you can also find this show and my daily news roundup. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, glad to be back. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, I like that we've done a couple episodes in the past couple of weeks. Whenever I get feedback on this show, it's typically included in there that, hey, I like it when Will Porter comes on. So hopefully we have another good one for everybody today, Will. We got about 4 things to cover, and we're hopefully going to get in depth on a couple of them. The first is the New Zealand shooting. This event I haven't covered on the show because I didn't see a super relevant foreign policy angle, but Will really pitched one to me, and I like it, and I think it's an extremely important point. So, Will, if you just want to kind of give the basic outline of the shooting on the show, because I haven't discussed it, and then what kind of particular evidence you're focusing your analysis on.
Yeah, sure. So, just to cover the basics of the shooting, we're all pretty much familiar with the pattern of these now. An Australian living in New Zealand, got a bunch of guns together and went to 2 different mosques and killed 50 people. And so, that's the basic story there. At first, they had several suspects. They had like 4 people, I think, in custody, but they've kind of landed on it was really just this one guy. Typically we end up with that lone wolf kind of narrative, and it does appear to be that it was a lone wolf attack in this case. So we can get into sort of the broader analysis, but that is the basic, facts of the case.
All right. So what we're going to be talking about on today's show, and, kind of this idea you have, is about the gray zone. And I've never, I don't think, actually covered the concept of the gray zone on the show, but it's really important. So, Will, why don't you go ahead and lay out what the gray zone actually is?
Sure. So, the gray zone is sort of a concept in like social theory, which describes a realm of like tolerance and coexistence and moderation between different cultural groups or demographics like living in the same society. And so a popular sort of like where this term started to get popularized in the field of, geopolitics and foreign policy was the group, the Islamic State, actually used to make a lot of reference to this in their propaganda. And so in the context of the Islamic State, the gray zone would be sort of where like Islam and Western values can peacefully coexist and interact. And so ISIS sought to destroy the gray zone by sort of polarizing the 2 groups. They wanted to radicalize people in the West, radicalize Muslims, and sort of instigate a conflict that would ultimately result in, an outcome that was closer to their own goals. So they wanted to have more militant Muslims on their side. They wanted to sort of like instigate this grand, culture war narrative. And so that's sort of what the gray zone is this like realm of moderation and tolerance. And so the New Zealand shooter, this guy was a white nationalist, and he sort of wanted to use his act of violence as sort of like a propaganda of the deed type of thing. And one of his goals in doing this and carrying out this act of violence was to destroy what is called the gray zone. And in fact, there's even he left this manifesto with a lot of his views and his motivations and stuff in it. And there's some specific passages that I think are extremely relevant to this concept of the gray zone. And so there's a section in this manifesto entitled "Why Did You Carry Out the Attack?" And he's sort of listing all his motivations and reasons. And he's mostly talking about taking revenge for people that he sees as victims of what he calls the invaders. And he means Muslims and foreigners, non-Europeans by that. But in this middle section in the middle of this section, he writes that one of his motivations was to, quote, agitate the political enemies of my people into action, to cause them to overextend their own hand and experience the eventual and inevitable backlash as a result. And then also the next passage, he says, to incite violence, retaliation, and further divide. between the European people and what he calls invaders currently occupying European soil. And so there, I think, is a very perfect encapsulation of the concept of the gray zone, of trying to polarize and radicalize people and to increase the divide between these different social groupings. And I just find it interesting and how many similarities there are with a group like the Islamic State, who had like very similar motivations.
Yeah, and I guess talking about the gray zone itself, one kind of interesting point I've always thought about it is that it kind of accepts that the natural state of things is for people to more or less get along. And so I think it falls very much in line with like Hoppian argumentation ethics, with this idea that generally, the state is that we can all get along without violence. And it has to be for these people to achieve their, extremely terrible, extremely hateful, radical, destructive, awful ends, that they have to inflict a huge amount of violence to try to, throw things out of balance and create a spiral where we all start to hate each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Like even just to refer it all to the gray zone, it implies that there is sort of this natural harmony in society between these different groupings and that they actually can coexist and get along. And people like this, groups like ISIS, they're trying to destroy that social harmony.
Will, you actually read the manifesto. Was there anything else in it that you thought was notable, specifically as in line with his motivations?
Yeah, I mean, if you read through the manifesto, it's pretty obvious that this guy, the shooter, was, he subscribes to a lot of white nationalist or like neo-Nazi, theories and talking points and statistics. And so, like, even the title of the manifesto, The Great Replacement, that's actually a reference to a theory put forward by a French academic named Renaud Camus, who has, it's unfortunate he shares that last name with such a great, another great thinker. But this Camus guy believed that, a group of elites are trying to replace white Europeans with Africans and Muslims. And, it's basically just a variant of the white genocide concept. But it's clear this guy was very much inspired by these ideas, this idea of white genocide and, white decline or something. Some people have actually tried to argue that this guy passed through what's called the libertarian to alt-right pipeline. But if you kind of read through the document, if you read through his manifesto, he makes it pretty clear that he started out his travels as a communist. And so that doesn't really fit in. It's not really consistent with the typical, pipeline, alt-right libertarian pipeline that's often put forward. And so, yeah, I think basically his motivations, they were pretty generic, like, white nationalist, neo-Nazi kind of things, kind of concepts. But one thing that I would point out about the manifesto is that some parts of it are insincere. And like deliberately so. And so you can find in a couple areas of this manifesto, the shooter puts like memes in there. He puts like weird, internet culture and internet humor. And then at one point he even says that a right-wing activist, I guess you'd call her, Candace Owens, he says that she was his biggest influence in doing this and carrying out the shooting. But that he couldn't endorse some elements of her extreme views. And so I think that was pretty clearly put there to like, mess with the media and kind of, create even more, incitement and conflict. So I guess that would be my summary of the manifesto. There's not a lot of great ideas in there. There's not that much interesting stuff in there, but particularly the thing about the gray zone, I think that's like the most significant aspect of this.
Yeah, well, I guess the part I want to talk about now is that there's a lot of censorship around this event, and I think there are strong arguments for, kind of limiting this guy's, public notoriety and visibility, and that's certainly not what me and Will are trying to do on today's show, but to talk about the particular motivations and the ends he's, looking for to achieve those, and, what kind of, dangers we should be looking for. Because if we don't understand his motivations and what he's trying to achieve, we could end up falling into the trap, just like we did with Osama bin Laden, right? And so if we, understand this time, just like we should have understood with Osama bin Laden, he was looking to provoke an overreaction and looking to start all this hate and conflict. And so if we really want to oppose him and, to reject his terrible ideas, what we have to do is the exact opposite of what he was trying to do, which is, to bring people together. And there's certainly been a lot of that in the wake of this, New Zealand event. And I know a lot of that news ends up, coming off pretty cheesy and just like, cheap mainstream media, fluff journalism. It is very important. As I talked about before, that the natural state of things is for people to, get along and come together in the reaction to this tragedy. So, Will, I'll go ahead and let you talk about why you decided to read this manifesto and why you want to talk about it on my show.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, you make a great point in terms of, like, the censorship. I mean, yeah, we don't want to, like, necessarily popularize this guy or, you know, his ideas, or make it so, you know, other future, you know, people who want to do something similar in the future think that they can get publicity from it. You know, we even had a discussion off air of, like, exactly how we should discuss this and how we should, you know, proceed. But it is, I think, like you said, important to discuss the motivations of, you know, people who do these kinds of things. Are there things that we can avoid? Are there signs that we can, you know, or you know, are there phenomenon out there that are making this more likely? Is it creating this kind of, you know, atmosphere where these things happen? Now, certainly, I think, you know, we obviously would make a foreign policy point about this, that, you know, a lot of this, you know, a lot of the, you know, large movements of populations, the migrant, the refugee crisis, a lot of this stuff is indeed tied back to, you know, U.S. foreign policy. Not to say that all of the shooters, you know, accusations and everything that he was mad about is necessarily had merit. You know, I think maybe some of the things he was blowing out of proportion, like the migrant violence, you know, I think there's a lot of sort of right-wing, like, sensationalism that goes on there. But if you censor this, if you censor discussion of this, censor the manifesto, censor, you know, anything surrounding it like that, it makes it so these things can't be, you know, brought into the light of day. They can't be analyzed with a sort of sober mind. In terms of the video, I guess I understand, because this shooter, we didn't mention this, live streamed this act of violence. It's a terrible video. And so I suppose I can see why, you know, places like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook would like to keep that video off. But I have seen even discussion of censoring the manifesto itself, and I think that's sort of going too far in terms of, you know, blocking out relevant and important discussion of this kind of event.
Yeah, you know, as from a libertarian perspective, I think there's sometimes an overreaction against some forms of censorship. And if, you know, the mainstream media and kind of groups came together in the journalistic community, if there was one with integrity, decided that, hey, when there's these, you know, big shooting incidents, we're not going to, you know, mention the name of the shooter, and we're not going to, you know, I've seen a lot of the footage blurring out his face, and you know, really trying to downplay, you know, his name and to give him a notoriety. That to me is okay. If, you know, Facebook and Twitter develop standards that have a certain level of violence that they keep off their sites, or that feels, you know, it to be, if ISIS is killing people, if this guy is killing people, we're not going to promote, you know, what they wanted us to show, then I think that's fine. At the same time, you know, maybe a crackdown like in New Zealand, where I think, you know, I've read at least reports that even possession of the video was, you know, a jailable offense. That seems to be too much. But, you know, certainly if, you know, these networks don't want to popularize that, that's fine. All right. Well, the next story I wanted to talk about, Will, is we're moving to Germany here. And there's a court case going on in the German courts dealing with the U.S. drone program. You know, this isn't something that's popularly known, but the Germany plays kind of an essential role in the U.S. drone program. It's not something that you would necessarily think was the case, but, you know, when you're dealing with a global empire, you have to have little bases around the world. And, you know, Germany's, you know, looking, at least took a lawsuit that I'm sure would never come up in the United States. So talk a little bit about the lawsuit, Will, and the ruling we got from the judge.
Yeah, sure. So, like, as you said, you know, there's a air base in Germany, the Ramstein Air Base, and this acts sort of as an important relay point for the American drone program. And recently, through a European human rights organization, like sort of their equivalent to like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, through this organization, 3 Yemeni plaintiffs actually brought this case to the German court, alleging that this Ramstein Air Base was sort of involved in violations of international law, that it played some role in that. And so this is still a developing story, so we don't really have an outcome here, but the court has ruled that the German government has to review U.S. operations from that airbase, and that the German government also ought to pressure the U.S. to abide by international law in its strikes, particularly ones flown out from the Ramstein base. And so, as I said, there's not been any kind of real outcome of this case yet, but it is interesting to see how sort of foreign states, how pressure from these foreign states might actually be the thing that might rein in American actions abroad. You know, with domestic pressure, you know, there's always some, but it always seems to be lacking. But perhaps this, you know, foreign pressure might be the thing to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important because usually when I think about taking on the empire, I think it has to be done from within the United States, just because we are the empire. You know, these are our satellite states. But, and especially as, you know, American, I think hegemony wanes, then there's going to be more and more I guess, at least potential for these countries to be able to make their own decisions and at times say no to the U.S. empire. And so not all the anti-war stuff has to be centered in the United States. And I know there's a lot of work in other countries, against the U.S. empire. And it's important to, keep an eye on that and pursue that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is also important to point out just how much the U.S. sort of relies on foreign allies for maintaining this empire. And that indeed there actually might be more weak points than we realize, more points to attack with sort of these foreign allies. There might be more we can do in that regard in terms of marshaling pressure against this empire.
All right, next, I want to move on to Boeing, Patrick Shanahan, who's the acting U.S. Secretary of Defense, and some possible corruption. This is something that I've been talking about on the show for months. So I'm not to take too much of a victory lap, but I was talking about this pretty early on. So it was a problem that with Patrick Shanahan first taking a Deputy Secretary of Defense role in 2017, and then in December of 2018, his promotion to Acting Secretary of Defense with the resignation of James Mattis, and the fact that he was a decades-long Boeing employee who played, essential roles in, I believe, the Dreamliner project and attack helicopters and radar systems. And so, he's a big lifelong guy at Boeing. I'm sure he has a lot of friends there. He has a lot of stake and investment there. And I said, well, it seems like to me that, the U.S. may start making a lot of Boeing purchases. And that seems to be what happened. So, Will, tell us all about it.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, this Patrick Shanahan is previously a 30-year veteran of Boeing, where he started working in 1986. And Boeing, of course, is one of the major U.S. arms contractors, and it's one of the biggest aviation companies in the world, if not the biggest. And so while at Boeing, Shanahan worked on a wide variety of commercial projects, but also on Boeing's sort of military end. He worked on their missile defense system program and a number of military aircraft. And he mostly served in positions like high-level management and oversight positions, and he would come to be known as a fix-it man for Boeing, somebody who you could sort of throw at a problem and he'd quickly get you a solution. So this guy, he served as the vice president and general manager of several divisions and subdivisions at Boeing, including the Missile Defense System program. At one point, he oversaw all Army aviation programs at facilities in Philadelphia and Mesa, Arizona. And by the time he left this company for the position in the Trump administration for the Deputy SecDef, he was the senior vice president for supply chain and operations, where he reported directly to Boeing CEO Dennis Muhlenberg. And he was also a member of Boeing's executive council. And so, in other words, I'm just trying to say this guy was a very high-level Boeing employee. He was not just a nameless branch manager or something. And his connections to Boeing's corporate leadership and their whole decision-making process are guaranteed. They're ironclad. And so Shanahan, though, before he took any position in the Trump administration, he actually made an ethics agreement. So typically under federal ethics rules, he would have been expected to recuse himself for 2 years from any kind of dealings with Boeing. But as far as I understand it, in June of 2017, he submitted this ethics agreement detailing how he would avoid these conflicts of interest and received some waivers to bypass some of the regular ethics procedures. And so in that agreement, he said he would divest from Boeing and get rid of all of his stock and financial stakes and, of course, recuse dealings with them, quit employment, of course. And so he's apparently was good to go. He made all these promises and, recused himself of all dealings. However, last week, this watchdog called the Citizens for Responsibilities and Ethics in Washington filed a complaint with the DOD's Inspector General saying that Shanahan had actually used his position with the Pentagon to promote Boeing and disparage its competitors. And so that's sort of the basic story here. I have a lot of detail to get into about that, but I'll let you respond.
Yeah, well, I guess I could just mention here, two big sales. Since he's became Acting Secretary of Defense, $2 billion or more sales for Boeing airplanes. The first was a $1 billion sale for, I believe, 8 F-15 and then the ETS variant. And then the more recent was a $4 million buy for 78 F-18. I believe it's the A and B variants. And I think they're mostly Marines. So, that's what you have here. You have Acting Secretary of Defense, who was a longtime employee from Boeing, and then suddenly, boom, 2 big buys from Boeing. Also, I guess it's worth mentioning right now, Will, and this is very circumstantial, but the Boeing stock wasn't doing very well with the grounding of all their MAX 8 planes. After that, another one crashed. So, it seems to be a time when maybe the company could use some influx of good news and, a bunch of government money coming in to make all the investors real happy with Boeing again.
No doubt. And yeah, and in addition to the deals that you just mentioned, for the F-15EX and the F-18s, excuse me, in September of 2018 alone, last year, while Shanahan was still the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Boeing won over 20 contracts worth like nearly $14 billion just in that month alone. And, he was still the Deputy Defense Secretary. However, the Deputy Defense Secretary is actually more likely to deal with, like, contractors and oversee these kinds of things. Because apparently Deputy Defense Secretaries, they're not so involved in, like, war making and actual policy. They're more involved in overseeing the sort of day-to-day operations. And so I'm not totally sure what, like, direct, involvement Shanahan had with any of these contracts, but the fact, like, his less senior position for the 2018 contracts, that does not make it less likely that he had some involvement. And so I found that interesting too. There's an abundance of contracts that have gone through between the U.S. government and Boeing since this guy has had a high level position. I should take a brief digression here to point out here that the watchdog that brought this complaint to the Inspector General, CREW, or the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, this group is run by David Brock. And David Brock is the founder of Media Matters, and he's sort of a longtime, like, elite Democrat partisan. David Brock founded Correct the Record, which is a site dedicated to defending Hillary Clinton and spinning all negative news about her. Politico even at one point described this CREW organization as Hillary Clinton's attack dog. And so these are things just to keep in mind about, like, who's bringing this allegation to the fore. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean that it's incorrect, but you should, have some skepticism given who we're dealing with here. This CREW organization might not be totally trustworthy. Now, let me say, too, the IG has launched a probe, but has reached no conclusion about wrongdoing on this at all. So we're not totally sure that there's going to be any outcome of this. Patrick Shanahan says that he welcomes the investigation, but who knows if that's just to, like, maintain appearances or, to make it look like he's innocent. I'm not totally sure.
Right. Well, I guess a couple of points I would make is I also saw that Elizabeth Warren tweeted out that she was looking at conducting an investigation here. And so it's still political motives, 2020 candidate and everything, but she is a U.S. senator. So if she's conducting an investigation, that I think gives maybe a little bit more weight. And then even if there's not any corruption on anybody's particular motive, thing, they're not actually thinking about it. If you have somebody who wants to get a promotion and knows his boss worked at Boeing for 20 years and you're, thinking about what project or what, thing you might propose to him that is most likely to buy into, well, you think and have a pretty good estimate that he probably really believes in the Boeing products. He probably really thinks the F-30 or the F-15 and the F-15 are great planes. And if you go to him with this, he's going to love it. And so, it's about pleasing your boss. And that's what most people do when they go to work every day. And, from Patrick Shanahan's position, he may not even be thinking that, well, my employees I'm pushing my employees to buy these planes, or I'm promoting employees that buy these planes. But if he really believes in the products, and the company he was associated with, then he might think that, oh man, these people are really outside the box and great thinkers. The F-35 is a total crap product and everybody knows it. And they're proposing this radical solution of F-15Xs, and this is a great thing. And those are really great planes, and I know my company is going to make a great thing for Americans. And you know what I mean? So I think just how people operate, that there's just too much possibility for corruption, even if it's not explicit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, we could say that, Boeing is the number 2 defense contractor behind Lockheed in America. They're, with or without Shanahan, they're going to get contracts and a lot of government money. However, like you're saying, like just simply the presence of a Boeing veteran, of a Boeing executive in such a high position, so close to the decision-making process, it just skews incentives. It just, even if nobody is explicitly corrupt, which is, I refuse to believe that. That would be a naive thing to believe, that there's no explicit corruption in the Pentagon. But even if you did believe that, there's still just there's institutional incentives and momentums, and like you said, Shanahan's worldview. Of course, he's going to think the world of Boeing. It's the company that took care of him for 30 years. So yeah, these things are definitely worth looking into. And, even if we find that Shanahan, did actually recuse himself, it's still worth looking into how the military industrial complex works and the momentums behind it, and just how it gets to the point that it's at now, where so much money is being spent on these contracts.
All right, well, last thing I had for today's show is Somalia. I've been talking on the show pretty frequently about how I feel, the U.S. war has really sneakily gotten big there. I've tried the best I could to kind of trap at least the number of airstrikes AFRICOM is admitting to, which I think from journalism by Amanda Sperber that I've talked about in the past on the show is definitely undercounted. Typically, you have to ask them if they conducted the strike, and that's the only way you get the answers. Now, one interesting and something I've been very skeptical of when it comes to these drone strikes is they always say all the people dead are Al-Shabaab. Every single time, it's Al-Shabaab, Al-Shabaab, Al-Shabaab. I think there's been 1 or 2 or 3 against ISIS, but almost every time Al-Shabaab fighters died. And it doesn't seem right to me, and I think there's a new report out from Amnesty that contradicts that.
Yeah, there is. Just recently, Amnesty put out a thing called The Hidden U.S. War in Somalia. And that is certainly a good title. I don't think a lot of people are really even aware that, there's U.S., armed conflict going on in Somalia that the U.S. is a part of. So this report found that in just 5 strikes, in just a handful of strikes in Somalia over the last 2 years, that 14 civilians were killed. And just those small, in that small proportion of strikes. That's just a handful of the 100+ strikes carried out in the country since 2017. And so already this is cutting directly against AFRICOM's, claim that 0 civilians have been killed. Amnesty reached out to AFRICOM for a comment, but a spokesman repeated the command's denial that any Somali citizens have been killed or civilians have been killed by U.S. actions. And that is a near impossibility if you even just consider sort of like the record of U.S., the American record in other countries. We clearly see that there's never a case where there are 0 casualties. So these 5 strikes, they're carried out with both like manned aircraft, so like actual fighters or bombers, and also with Reaper drones. And the 5 that they looked at, that Amnesty analyzed, these happened in a region just outside of the capital of Mogadishu. And this is a region said to be largely under the control of Al-Shabaab. And Amnesty is saying they believe that some of these strikes may actually amount to war crimes, certainly violations of international law. And so that's the basic gist of what the Amnesty report found. But there's a lot of good detail in there, just like getting into even the forensics of some of these cases.
Yeah. So I guess the interesting thing here is I don't understand how the U.S. conducts this war, really. They claim, I think at times, AUMF of 2001, but these are military airstrikes. These aren't like CIA drone strikes. And then there's also the complicating thing that Trump declared it an area of active hostility, so that allowed the U.S. to loosen rules of engagement. And I believe I even read an article where there was a special forces commander, former one from Somalia, saying that the 4 categories the U.S. looks for when determining whether or not to carry out a strike would be age, gender, location, and proximity to Al-Shabaab.
Yeah, I mean, how many people do you think end up classified as a legitimate target just based on that, that broad, classification?
Yeah, anybody who's 16 to 45 and is a guy and lives in the southern third of Somalia.
Yep, that basically, classifies it. That makes it legit. You're now a legitimate target. You can be, bombed or killed at any time. Your life is like, subject to being revoked at any moment. So yeah, that's that is how they.
And we all should be horrified at this policy, and also take a second to remember that this was the Obama policy in Yemen for many years with their drone program. Anybody who was a military-age male was considered a terrorist if they were killed by a U.S. drone strike unless proven otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there have been all kinds of absurd standards used. There was another, I believe, a separate drone program where they called it signature strikes, where they based they didn't base on any kind of real intelligence, only like correlations to behavior. So, he was talking on a cell phone to this person at this time, and that's what classifies you as a legitimate target. But, as you mentioned, too, the rules of engagement have sort of been lifted, and so the gloves have really come off in Somalia. I believe under Trump, strikes in Somalia specifically have tripled in number, which have now surpassed the number, the combined number of strikes in both Yemen and Libya. And so really these are, the rules of engagement are low, and the rules of engagement are loose, I should say, and it seems like they're taking advantage of that.
And one of the worst parts about it is I really don't see any progress being made, and as far as I understand, the Somali National Army is pretty brittle. It really doesn't even have the capability to go in and secure the area that is, made vacant if you actually do kill 10 al-Shabaab fighters. You take out one of their checkpoints. Well, that's only good if they don't have 10 people to replace those 10 people with. And you're able to kind of get in and secure that territory first. And that doesn't seem to be happening at all in Somalia. And so at this point, it's just killing people. And then you fall victim to Stanley Crystal's insurgent math. That even if you're only killing the insurgents here, you're creating more of them with every single airstrike. And, with the instability in the airstrikes comes infrastructure damage and generally a poorer region, which means people only have, less and less options for work other than soldiers.
Right. And then, playing into that insurgent math is like, the United States' reliance on local elements. So in some cases you have some guy, some local commander, some guy that we're training telling you, oh yeah, these guys over here are Shabab for sure. When really it's like his business rivals or some family that he's been feuding with over some property dispute or something. Like this is the kind of thing that's happening all the time. And so that's, you go and, slaughter a whole village of people, and that insurgent math really starts adding up now. And you're never going to be able to, get rid of this threat by continued occupation. It's a recipe for, forever war.
Yeah. And, one of the other things is we have some regional actors in there. We've encouraged the, African Union Forces, I think is the name of the organization. And so there's Kenyan and Ethiopian and Burundi and Ugandans there. I think the Burundi actually announced they're withdrawing some of their forces pretty recently. And it was actually Ugandan general, or whatever his rank was in the Ugandan army, that warned the U.S. not to carry out their counter insurgency operation in a region of Somalia in 2016 that absolutely failed miserably and led to the death of at least a bunch of civilians, if not provoked a massive terrorist attack as well. And so, there doesn't even seem to be a whole lot of regional taste for this war.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Will, do you have anything else to wrap up here with on Somalia?
No, I mean, it's an unfortunate situation that it just seems like, things just keep getting worse for Somalis. I suppose it's not as bad as the famines and stuff that have happened in recent decades, but, the situation there is just, it seems to be deteriorating.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the bad and worst things is that if it happens that there is another drought, because there's usually, I guess, except like a case like Yemen where it's solely just inflicted upon them, but when you look at in the past with Somalia or Ethiopia, it's a lot of times combined between a civil war or a regional war and a drought or something, that naturally occurs. And so if these are the years where there's not going to be a drought in the Horn of Africa, it's important that there's, infrastructure developments and there's, a creation of capital. That way people can survive if, the natural conditions get worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I'm sure, Will, that, if there's a drought in Somalia in, 3 years and 100,000 people starve to death, people aren't going to be looking back to this time and think, well, the U.S. destroyed all this infrastructure with their, hundreds of airstrikes under the Trump administration. And that's what, is at least a part of the cause of the reason things are bad here. But, that's kind of what it is.
And I guess we'll have to be there to remind them of this time.
All right. Well, Will, thanks so much for coming back off the show. Tell everybody where they can find your work.
Yeah, anytime, man. I'm always glad to come on here. You guys can find my writing at antiwar.com, although I have not been writing there as much lately, but I do have some archive there. Consortiumnews.com, the Libertarian Institute, the Daily Sheeple. I think those are the major places. My Twitter handle is WKP ANCAP, ANCAP. And if you'd like to support what I do, you can do that through Patreon, patreon.com/WKP journalist.
All right. Find the show online at the Libertarian Institute. Check out my website, immersionnews.com, patreon.com/foreign policy focus, to get some monetary support to the show. And check me out on Twitter at KYAAALE. Thanks, Will.
Thanks.